At some point on this path, many people begin to feel something unsettling that they can't quite explain. It isn't dramatic at first. There's no clear crisis, no obvious breakdown. Instead, there's a quiet discomfort that creeps into ordinary moments. Conversations that once felt natural now feel forced. Places that once felt familiar now feel strangely foreign. You go back to your old routines, your old relationships, even your old ambitions, and something inside you says this doesn't fit anymore. And that realization can be deeply disturbing. Most people immediately assume something has gone wrong. They think they're becoming antisocial, ungrateful, arrogant, or detached. They worry that they're losing themselves. But according to Alan Watts, what's actually happening is not a loss of self, but the beginning of seeing through the self you thought you were. The discomfort you feel is not a failure of your awakening. It is one of its clearest signs. Alan Watts often explained that what we call identity is largely a social role. From childhood onward, we are trained to play parts. The good child, the smart one, the responsible one, the achiever, the helper, the rebel. Over time, these roles become so familiar that we confuse them with who we truly are. We don't just play the role, we believe it, and for a while it works. The role fits. Life feels coherent. But awakening changes the rules of the game. As awareness deepens, you begin to notice the gap between your inner experience and the role you're performing. You see yourself saying things you don't mean, reacting in ways that no longer feel authentic, maintaining connections that rely on an older version of you. And suddenly, the life you built starts to feel like a costume you can't take off. Heavy, constricting, and strangely artificial. Watts would say that this is the moment when the mask starts to slip. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you're no longer unconscious enough to wear it comfortably. The role hasn't changed, but you have. And the deeper your awareness grows, the harder it becomes to pretend that the old identity still fits. This is why returning to your old life feels exhausting. It's not that the people or places are bad. It's that they were built around a version of you that no longer exists. And trying to squeeze yourself back into that shape creates a quiet suffering, one that feels like loneliness even when you surrounded by others, and confusion even when everything appears fine on the surface. This is where many people panic. They ask, if I don't fit here anymore, then who am I? And that question marks the true beginning of this phase of awakening. When this sense of not fitting in deepens, it often brings an unexpected grief. Alan Watts spoke frequently about how the ego clings to continuity, to the feeling that I am the same person I have always been. So when that continuity begins to fracture, even gently, the mind interprets it as loss. You may find yourself missing your old enthusiasm, your old confidence, or the ease with which you once moved through familiar social worlds. And yet, when you try to return to them, they no longer nourish you. They feel hollow, mechanical, rehearsed. Watts would say that this grief arises because the ego is losing its reference points. Identity, in the ordinary sense, depends on contrast and reinforcement. You know who you are because others recognize you as that person. You play a role, they respond to it, and the loop confirms your sense of self. But as awakening unfolds, that loop weakens. You no longer receive the same satisfaction from recognition, approval, or belonging. Not because you've become superior or detached, but because you've begun to see the game itself. This is why spending time with old friends can feel strangely draining. The conversations circle around familiar themes, old stories, shared identities. And while nothing is overtly wrong, something feels off. You sense an invisible pressure to be who you used to be, to react the same way, to care about the same things. Watts would describe this as the friction between awareness and conditioning. The more aware you become, the more obvious the conditioning feels. At this stage, many people try to correct the discomfort by forcing themselves to adapt. They tell themselves they're being dramatic, that they should be grateful, that they should try harder to fit in. But this effort only deepens the exhaustion. According to Watts, effort applied to identity is always misdirected, because identity is not something you can fix or improve. It's something you eventually see through. What you're encountering here is not a rejection of your old life, but a loosening of identification with it. The structures that once gave you stability are no longer holding you in the same way. And because the mind craves certainty, it interprets this loosening as danger. You may feel anxious, ungrounded, or as if you're floating without a solid sense of self. But Watts would gently remind you that this floating is not a mistake. It's what happens when you stop gripping the familiar roles that once defined you. You're not meant to immediately replace them with new ones. This phase is not about constructing a better identity. It's about recognizing that identity itself is a temporary arrangement, not the truth of who you are. And this is why nothing quite fits anymore. Not because you failed to belong, but because belonging to a fixed identity is no longer possible once awareness has begun to expand. As this process continues, you may begin to notice something even more unsettling. It's not just people and places that no longer fit, but you yourself no longer feel familiar. Alan Watts often spoke about this moment as the collapse of the center, the sense that there is a solid someone inside, steering the ship of life. When that center begins to dissolve, the mind reacts with fear. It asks, if I'm not who I thought I was, then what am I? This question can feel terrifying because the ego depends on definition. It wants clear boundaries, labels, and narratives. But awakening, as Watts emphasized, does not provide new definitions. It removes the need for them. And this is why the in-between phase feels so uncomfortable. You're no longer anchored to the old identity, but you haven't yet learned to rest in awareness itself. During this phase, many people experience a strange emptiness. Motivation drops. Goals that once felt meaningful now feel arbitrary. You may look at your plans for the future and feel no emotional connection to them. This doesn't mean you've become lazy or depressed. According to Watts, it means the psychological energy that once fueled your striving has withdrawn. The fuel was identity, the need to become someone, to maintain an image, to fulfill a role. When that fuel fades, the engine naturally slows down. This is often misinterpreted as stagnation. But in reality, something far more subtle is happening. Consciousness is disentangling itself from the structures it once used to define itself. You are no longer driven by the same unconscious compulsions. And without those compulsions, the mind feels disoriented, like a compass spinning without a magnetic north. Watts compared this stage to a person who has spent their entire life gripping a rope in the dark, believing it's the only thing keeping them from falling. When the light comes on, they realize there is no cliff, but their hands are still clenched, aching from holding on. Letting go feels dangerous, even though there's nothing to fall into. The fear comes not from reality, but from habit. This explains why the urge to figure yourself out becomes so strong. You may feel compelled to read more, analyze more, search for explanations, labels, or new identities that feel solid again. But Watts would say that this impulse is just the ego trying to rebuild itself in a more refined form. And while this can be tempting, it only prolongs the discomfort. What you're being invited into here is not clarity in the usual sense, but a deeper trust. A trust that you do not need to know who you are in order to be alive, present, and whole. The old life no longer fits because it was built around a question you are no longer asking, who should I be? And until you stop trying to answer that question, the sense of not fitting will remain. At this stage, the sensation of not belonging can extend beyond people, work, or routines. Even familiar comforts, hobbies, routines, achievements may no longer satisfy. Alan Watts often explained that the world we once knew is constructed to sustain a particular identity. Once that identity begins to dissolve, the world itself feels slightly off-key. Music may seem less moving, work less engaging, conversation more superficial. This is not a sign that the world has changed. It is a sign that your perception has shifted, that your attention is no longer invested in the old patterns. Many people panic here, fearing they are becoming disconnected or abnormal. Yet Watts would say the discomfort is actually a signal of growth. It is the mind's way of saying the old structures are no longer serving consciousness. They were never meant to last forever. They were scaffolding, temporary supports that helped you navigate early life. Awakening simply reveals the impermanence of those supports, and with that realization comes both relief and uncertainty. During this period, there can also be a sense of social isolation. Friends, family, and colleagues continue to operate according to shared assumptions and expectations, while you feel yourself slipping into a space they cannot perceive. This creates subtle tension, not from conflict, but from a mismatch of resonance. Watts would describe this as the natural friction between an awakened awareness and habitual social conditioning. You are simply vibrating at a slightly different frequency, and the old life no longer resonates with your evolving consciousness. It is important to understand, as Watts often emphasized, that this mismatch is not a judgment on you or others. It is simply a fact of growth. Just as a bird outgrows the nest, your mind has begun to outgrow the identity and environments that once contained it. The discomfort is a necessary signpost, a guide pointing to the in-between space where transformation occurs. Many people attempt to rush through this stage by seeking new identities, communities, or roles that fit better. But Watts warned that replacing old structures too quickly only recreates the same cycle. The key is presence and observation, allowing yourself to inhabit the space between old self and new self without forcing resolution. You are learning to exist without relying on predefined labels or external validation to feel at home in consciousness itself, rather than in a role or a past. This is the paradox of outgrowing identity. The world does not need to change for you to be at peace. You simply need to stop trying to fit what you have become into a mold that no longer applies. And this is the invitation Watts offers, to rest in the awareness that you are not your roles, your past, or your accomplishments. You are the consciousness that witnesses them, and that awareness is enough. As this process deepens, you may notice a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in how you relate to life itself. Alan Watts often pointed out that identity is not just social. It is a filter through which all experience passes. When that filter begins to dissolve, ordinary life can feel simultaneously strange and vibrant. Tasks that were once mundane may seem absurd, trivial, or even meaningless. Yet beneath this apparent emptiness is a kind of clarity that the old self could not perceive. You are beginning to see life without the distortions of accumulated expectations, roles, and conditioning. This stage can feel disorienting because the old markers of achievement and satisfaction no longer hold. You may notice yourself withdrawing from certain obligations, not out of laziness, but because the pull to conform has weakened. Social approval, accolades, or material accumulation feel hollow. Watts would describe this as the awakening of discernment, the recognition that external validation can never fill the inner space of awareness. The discomfort arises because the old identity relied on these external measures to define itself. Without them, the mind experiences a temporary vacuum, a quiet alarm signaling that the familiar scaffolding has been removed. At the same time, there is a profound invitation here. Watts often said that when the ego begins to release its grip, consciousness has the opportunity to perceive its own source. This does not happen through forcing clarity, solving problems, or constructing new identities. It happens in stillness, in the quiet acknowledgement that you are no longer defined by what you do, what you own, or what others expect of you. In this sense, the dissonance you feel is not a mistake. It is an opening, a doorway into a more authentic mode of existence. You may also notice a subtle grief for the life you used to inhabit. The past self, the version that once fit seamlessly into the world, seems gone. Watts would describe this grief as the natural response of consciousness to the loss of a familiar narrative. It is important to feel this grief fully, without attempting to fix it, avoid it, or rush past it. By allowing the sorrow and discomfort to exist without interference, you begin to inhabit the in-between space more fully. You are learning to embrace not only who you are becoming, but also the fact that transformation always involves leaving something behind. In practical terms, this phase calls for gentleness with yourself. You may need to retreat from certain environments or relationships temporarily, not as an act of rejection, but as a means of creating space for alignment. Watts emphasized that outgrowing identity is less about abandoning the world and more about finding harmony with a self that cannot be constrained by old forms. This is the quiet, often misunderstood revolution of awakening. Life appears to resist you when in reality, it is merely no longer filtered through a false self. As the awareness of outgrowing your old life deepens, something remarkable begins to unfold. Alan Watts often described this as the loosening of attachment, not just to things, people, or roles, but to the very idea of a fixed self. The old patterns of obligation, expectation, and habit no longer carry the same weight, and in their absence, there is a strange freedom. It is a freedom that feels simultaneously unsettling and expansive. You may notice moments where you are fully present, completely engaged, and yet unbound from the past self that once dictated your every action. This freedom can be frightening at first. The mind craves definition, clarity, and continuity. When the old identity dissolves, the familiar reference points vanish, leaving you in a liminal space. Watts often illustrated this with the metaphor of the river. If you cling too tightly to a particular stone, You are dragged along or left stranded when the current changes. But if you relax your grip, the water carries you naturally, and you move effortlessly through shifts in direction. In other words, the discomfort is not a signal of danger, but an invitation to flow with the changing contours of your own consciousness. During this period, you may also begin to notice the subtle social friction that comes from your transformation. Friends, family, and colleagues continue to operate under assumptions that no longer resonate with your evolving awareness. Watts described this as the inevitable result of growing beyond the shared illusions that once maintained your social identity. You are no longer fully participating in the collective story, and this can provoke both internal and external tension. But it is essential to recognize that this friction is not a punishment. It is a natural byproduct of alignment. Interestingly, as the old structures fade, your capacity for authenticity expands. Moments of stillness, simple presence, and unmediated experience become deeply nourishing. The satisfaction that comes from performing, achieving, or seeking approval diminishes, while the subtle joys of being awake, noticing a breeze, observing a thought without judgment, feeling a genuine connection, take on new significance. Watts often emphasized that this is not a replacement of one form of pleasure with another, but a shift in perception itself. The inner landscape is becoming less dependent on external reinforcement and more attuned to the intrinsic flow of life. Finally, it is worth noting that this stage is inherently transitional. You may feel that you are in limbo, caught between a past identity that no longer fits and a future self that has not yet emerged. Watts would remind us that the tension of liminality is fertile ground. It is the in-between where creativity, insight, and true awakening are born. The discomfort you feel is not a failure or an indication that something is wrong. It is the very mechanism by which consciousness expands. At this stage, the awareness of outgrowing your old life often brings a subtle, yet profound sense of solitude. Alan Watts frequently pointed out that true awakening is inherently solitary in its depth, not in the sense of loneliness, but in the sense that no one can experience it for you. The old social frameworks, shared identities, and familiar routines can no longer fully support the person you are becoming, and while this may feel isolating, it is also liberating. You are now allowed to exist without pretense, without performing for others, and without the constant reinforcement of old expectations. This solitude is fertile ground for self-discovery. Watts would say that when we finally stop seeking validation, belonging, and identity from external sources, we encounter the core of consciousness itself. It is in this quiet in-between state that the real work of awakening takes place. You begin to notice subtle aspects of yourself, your fears, your desires, your unresolved grief, and your deepest longings, all without needing to fix or judge them. The old life can no longer contain these truths, and neither can the old identity. The challenge, however, lies in navigating the stage without panic. Many people respond to the discomfort by trying to reconstruct the old life in new forms, or by seeking out communities that mirror familiar patterns. Watts warned against this impulse, emphasizing that doing so merely recreates the same constraints under a different guise. Instead, the path forward is to embrace the in-between, to allow the tension of not fitting to exist without attempting to resolve it prematurely. It is through this patient presence that a more authentic alignment begins to emerge. During this period, you may also notice a heightened sensitivity to superficiality and pretense. Situations, conversations, and environments that were once neutral may now feel discordant or exhausting. Watts would suggest that this is simply the recalibration of perception. Your consciousness is no longer tuned to the old frequencies of habit, ego, and social expectation. What once felt comfortable may now feel constraining, and what once felt hollow may now feel empty in ways that demand attention. This sensitivity is not a weakness. It is a sign of maturation, a deepening of awareness that guides you toward environments and relationships that truly resonate. Ultimately, the key insight Watts offers is this: outgrowing your old life is not a punishment or a sign of inadequacy. It is a natural outcome of awakening. The discomfort, the solitude, the subtle grief, and the disorientation are all integral to the process. They are the thresholds through which consciousness passes to reach a deeper sense of freedom, authenticity, and presence. What you are experiencing is not loss. It is the unfolding of a self that is not confined by past limitations, social expectations, or old roles. As you move through this transitional phase, It becomes clear that outgrowing your old life is less about rejecting the past and more about aligning with a deeper truth. Alan Watts often emphasized that the self is not a fixed object, but a fluid process, a continuous dance of awareness, experience, and perception. The old life no longer fits not because you are failing, but because the person who once fit into it has evolved. You have outgrown the mold, and that is the natural unfolding of consciousness. This realization brings a subtle liberation. You no longer need to force yourself into roles, routines, or social structures that feel false. There is permission, finally, to exist authentically, without compromise, without the constant validation of others. Watts would describe this as stepping into the space between identities, where life is no longer filtered through the ego's demands, but is experienced directly, fully, and without pretense. It is a quiet, profound freedom that carries both serenity and responsibility. The challenge, of course, is navigating uncertainty. The mind, trained to seek stability and clarity, struggles with ambiguity. You may ask yourself, who am I now? Where do I belong? How do I live in this new awareness? Watts' guidance is simple yet radical. You do not need to answer these questions immediately. The act of being present, of observing without attachment, of inhabiting the in-between, is itself the path. Identity is not something to be constructed. It is something to be discovered gently, over time, through attention and presence. In practical terms, this might look like creating space for stillness in your day, withdrawing temporarily from environments that feel misaligned, or simply observing your own reactions without judgment. It may involve releasing relationships or commitments that no longer resonate, not out of resentment, but out of integrity. Watts would remind us that the discomfort you feel is the companion of growth, a signal that consciousness is expanding, that the old container can no longer hold what is emerging. Ultimately, the message is one of trust. Trust that you are not losing yourself, but stepping into a broader, more authentic way of being. Trust that the emptiness you feel is fertile ground, capable of giving rise to insight, creativity, and profound alignment. Trust that outgrowing your old life is not a rejection, but an awakening to life as it truly is, without the distortions of past conditioning or societal expectation. Watts would remind us that this process is not a failure to belong, but the inevitable flowering of consciousness. So, as you move through this phase, remember, it is normal to feel disoriented, alienated, and even lonely. It is normal to grieve the self you were. But in this space, where the old no longer fits and the new has not yet fully emerged, you are discovering the deepest truth of all, that you are not your roles, your achievements, or your past. You are the awareness in which all of it appears, vast, unbounded, and perfectly aligned with life itself. And in that recognition, you find a freedom that nothing from the old world could ever give.